Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a great day today, and in this video we're going to be doing a review for The Dark Knight, which came out in 2008. Now this is one of the most culturally significant superhero films, or really just films in general. It was the first comic book film to gross $1 billion at box office, and it's just been considered one of the best superhero films, or just films in general. So to hop right into the review for this movie, what really works is the vibe from beginning to end. You can definitely tell that some of the plot beats were inspired from the Batman The Long Halloween comic, which is a really good comic, but the film also just tries to be this crime thriller, and it's just very exciting from beginning to end. There's a lot of action, there's a lot of chaos and destruction. Of course, there's always explosions and that kind of stuff when it comes to superhero movies, but in this movie it actually feels like there's more weight to them. And there's just some really intense sequences in here that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, and I really can't emphasize enough how from beginning to end you're going to be hooked. Of course, this is elevated by the score from Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard. It's just some really great music, and this movie also just has some really good themes in it, as the Joker is kind of wanting to expose people. It kind of picks up where Batman Begins left off, where that movie was kind of about corruption, and then in this movie it kind of shows the effects that Batman's had on the underworld, and you do have that scene early on with the Scarecrow and a Batman imposter. So this film just does a good job of picking up a year after Batman Begins left off and just kind of moving the story forward from there. Now, of course, the best part of this movie is Heath Ledger as the Joker, and of course he unfortunately passed away shortly after they were done filming, although it was pretty nice how he won an Oscar posthumously, and it was actually the first Oscar given to an actor from a superhero comic book movie. And I think what really made this Joker feel like the Joker from the comics is the fact that he really has no backstory. There are a couple different times in the movie where he tries to explain how he became the way he was, but they were contradictory, which is really cool because that just means he's unpredictable, he can't be trusted. And they just did a good job with this movie of making it feel like this could be a villain in the real world if the Joker was in the real world. But the Joker just really steals the show in this movie. And the first time I watched this movie, there were parts where I legitimately forgot it was even a Batman movie, just because of how much the Joker kind of outshines Batman. And it's not like Batman is bad in this movie, but I really don't think what they did with his character arc in this was quite as interesting as it could have been, because if this was the Michael Keaton or Ben Affleck version of the character, I think they would have been a little bit more memorable, because in this movie they did kind of allow Batman to be overshadowed by the Joker. And it's good that the Joker was really good in this movie, but I just think Batman could have been a little bit more interesting. And Christian Bale did a great performance, although I do think his performance in Batman Begins was a little bit better just because it was kind of an origin story, and it felt like there were more layers being explored there. Nonetheless though, Christian Bale did a really good job, but I do think his Bruce Wayne persona is a little bit better than his actual Batman persona. His Batman voice is definitely kind of weird in this movie. I don't think anyone's trying to deny that. And again, I don't think what they do with Batman in this movie is bad, but I don't think they went the best route with it, where they kind of had him wanting to retire, trusting that Harvey Dent would be able to kind of keep the criminals off the street eventually. And certain traits of Batman as a character have changed throughout history in the comics and other media, but at no point was he ever really like looking into retirement after only fighting crime for a year. So it does start to lose me a little bit there. And of course you have Rachel in this movie, kind of the reason that Batman wants to retire, so that he can have a life with her. And they actually recasted her in this movie. It was Maggie Gyllenhaal playing her instead of Katie Holmes, who played her in Batman Begins. And normally I am not a fan of recasting, but this is one of two exceptions, because to be completely honest, Katie Holmes didn't really have a very good performance in Batman Begins, so I think it actually is better that they went with a different actress in this movie. And as I said, there's supposed to be like a year in between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, which is plenty of time for someone's facial structure to look completely different. And if you're wondering, the other exception I have for a recast is in Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 when they recast Jennifer. And the reason I'm okay with that is because honestly, I don't think anyone would have ever noticed that if it wasn't for movie trivia on the internet. Anyways, of course you also have Harvey Dent in here. The movie kind of starts off where he has a good relationship with Gordon and Batman, and it does a good job of kind of foreshadowing that he's going to turn into a villain. Most particularly in the line where he says, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain," which is both a really great quote as well as a really great meme. But I just think it is really cool what they did with his campaign in the movie. I feel like in most forms of media media, Harvey Dent's always having some campaign. And just overall, he has some really great character development where he is supposed to be kind of this white knight, but he slowly kind of descends into madness, and then the Joker drives him over the edge and he becomes Two-Face. And just what we see of Two-Face in this movie I think is spot on. It's great, although it is pretty brief, and the CGI that they did for him was actually really good. Now I will say though, I do kind of wish they went with the classic story of like Maroni throwing the acid on his face, because they had Maroni in this movie anyways, and I feel like they could have set that up in a pretty good way. But nonetheless, they kind of just went with a little bit different of a story. It's not terrible, but I do kind of prefer the classic one. And then I don't know why this bothers me, because it really shouldn't, but Harvey Dent has like blonde hair in this movie. And in most forms of media, he has darker hair. And they change the hair colors of characters all the time in different forms of media. But for some reason, this just kind of bothers me, because I feel like it doesn't contrast that well with the rest of his design. But nonetheless, that's a nitpick. Of course, you have some other great characters in here, like Gordon, who's one of the few cops that's not corrupt, and he actually becomes the commissioner in this movie, and he fakes his death at one point. Scenes like that kind of shows you what kind of character he is. And Gary Oldman probably is my favorite of the actors who's played Commissioner Gordon. Of course, you have Michael Caine as Alfred in this movie as well. He just did a phenomenal job. He's just a really good mentor to Bruce. Of course, you had Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox in this movie as well. Another great character, and it's pretty cool seeing more bat technology in this movie, like the Bat Pod. And just overall, as I said, the story, the themes are really well done. There's some great shots in here. All the scenes are iconic. It's very exciting. And once you get to the final battle, it's one of the best final battles of any movie ever. So overall, I would just say this is a pretty phenomenal movie. But a lot of people have said it's overrated. And in my opinion, it's not like an unhealthy amount of overrated, but it is probably slightly overrated in the sense that there are some other comic book superhero movies that are just as good as this, or maybe even arguably better. Like even in this trilogy, I would say Batman Begins is just as good as this, maybe even better. So I definitely do think in a sense some people act like this movie is 10 out of 10, it's flawless, and I don't think it's quite that, but it is pretty good. There's definitely no denying that. But to kind of dive into some of the small problems I do have with this movie, first of all, most of what they filmed for Gotham City was filmed in Chicago, so certain parts of this movie it kind of feels like a generic city. I think it looked a little bit better in Batman Begins. It seemed like it had more of a distinct style and felt more like from the comics. And of course there's a part of this movie where Lau escapes to Hong Kong, and it's immediately followed up by Batman going there and capturing him. And it's a really awesome sequence, but part of me does kind of feel like the story could have flowed better if Lau just didn't go to Hong Kong and was captured in Gotham City, and they kind of just tweaked a few things here and there with the story to make it make sense. Another thing worth noting is Batman gets a suit upgrade in this movie, and certain parts of it I feel like are better than the Batman Begins suit, and certain parts of it I feel like are not. It's kind of nice how it's a little more flexible. They make the joke about him finally being able to turn his neck, and he even has night vision too, which is pretty cool. But I don't think the bat symbol on the suit is as good, and it feels like with the design there's a little bit too much going on. And they still kept going with like the all black design except for the yellow belt, so there was no like dark gray or anything like that. And you can also tell Christian Bale had lost a little bit of weight. He was more muscular in Batman Begins, and so that just made him feel more intimidating, whereas in this movie not so much. And when it comes to some of the fight scenes where it's just people punching each other and that kind of stuff, I feel like Christopher Nolan improved on the way he shot them, where in Batman Begins they were a little bit too choppy, there was too many cuts in those scenes. In this movie I feel like did a better job of not having as much cuts. You could actually kind of understand what was going on, but at the same time the choreography wasn't quite as good. And then of course there's a one really weird scene where the Joker drops Rachel off a roof and Batman like slides down the building and then catches her, and they fall from pretty high up but survive by landing on this car without even breaking any bones somehow. And I know Batman's cape can kind of like stop the fall a little bit by like gliding, but they didn't even really do that, and just the way the scene was shot feels super awkward. And once they land at the car, they kind of end the scene there and you don't even see like how the Joker escapes. So I think everyone can agree that scene's a little weird when you look into it, but people just choose kind of not to talk about that since the rest of the movie is pretty good. But if the rest of the movie wasn't good and people hated this movie, this is actually the scene people would have made fun of the most. And then my last problem I kind of have with this movie is that it didn't really end up setting up that much good stuff in the future. And what I mean by that is I don't really like what they did with Batman's story later on in The Dark Knight Rises. where he retired because of his leg injury, because somehow he broke his leg from falling off the one building, even though it was not as high up as the building where he landed on the car and survived. And again, I just think it's weird that Batman would want to retire from crime fighting after only doing it for a year. And of course, I'll talk about how he unretires in The Dark Knight Rises in my review for that movie. But it's not just what they did with Batman. I'm not the biggest fan of how they killed Two-Face off in this movie, because I feel like it would have been better if they kept him around as a villain for later movies. Now, they did do the smart move by not killing the Joker, and he even said a line in this movie about how he and Batman were destined to be fighting forever. Now, he didn't return for obvious reasons, but you do kind of have to give them credit for setting it up. But overall, my problems with this movie are pretty minor. As I said, from beginning to end, this is a very exciting, iconic, just phenomenal film overall. So on the quality scale of 0 to 100, we'll give it a 93%, and I would definitely recommend checking out this movie. Even if you're not a fan of superhero movies, you'd probably be a fan of this. But if you've seen it, let me know what you think about it in the comments section down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.